My name is Daniel Harris. I'm 46 years old, and just a few months ago, my wife and my mother-in-law were absolutely convinced that every single dollar I had worked for over 20 years belonged to them by divine right. They looked me straight in the eyes and with smiles dripping with poison threatened to leave me with nothing, using divorce as a weapon to drain my bank accounts dry. They thought they had me cornered. They believed my silence was fear and my calm was surrender. What they never imagined was that while they were plotting how to divide my wealth between themselves, I was already signing the documents that would leave them with exactly what they deserved: nothing. Greed causes a very particular kind of blindness. It makes you believe the person standing in front of you is weak simply because they are patient. But patience has a limit, and mine ended the day I overheard my mother-in-law whispering to my wife that they needed to take every last property from me before I caught on to their plan. That afternoon, as I quietly sipped my coffee, I watched them argue about which renovations they would make to the house with my money once I was out of the picture. In that moment, I stopped being the providing husband and became the architect of their financial downfall. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here, we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For nearly 2 decades, my life could be summed up in a single word: provision. I married Emily when we were both in our early 20s. Back then, we had little more than ambition and a rented apartment that always smelled of damp walls. I've never been the kind of man who knows how to stand still. I worked 12 hours a day, first as an employee at a logistics firm and later, after years of saving every dollar and skipping vacations, by founding my own distribution company. My mindset was simple. If I worked hard, my family would never have to worry about anything. And for a long time that was true. Emily never had to worry about an electricity bill, the cost of health insurance, or car maintenance. She took care of the house, or at least that's what she said, because over time we ended up hiring staff for almost everything. Gradually, her free time became occupied by her mother, Linda. My mother-in-law has always had an exquisite taste for other people's money. She never built anything of her own, but she knew exactly how to spend what belonged to others. At first, it seemed natural to help Linda. I paid off her debts, funded her trips, and allowed her to become part of our daily routine under the excuse of family closeness. I didn't realize I was inviting the enemy to sit at my own table. My relationship with Emily turned into an administrative exchange. I deposited, she spent. I came home late, exhausted from dealing with suppliers and logistical crises, and she greeted me with complaints about the gardener or the pool temperature. There was no intimacy, only a cold, expensive comfort. I became a spectator in my own home. I would sit down for dinner while the two of them talked about luxury brands, cruises, and the lives of people I didn't even know. If I tried to talk about company problems or my exhaustion, Linda would throw a bored glance my way and Emily would change the subject. I was a walking, talking ATM. As my company grew and contracts became more lucrative, their attitude changed. They no longer asked, they demanded. Linda began suggesting that the properties should be in Emily's name for security, as if my management were a constant risk. Emily, influenced by her mother's constant whispers, started questioning my investments. They wanted to see bank statements. They wanted to know exactly how much was in the reserve funds. I, blinded by routine and by a misplaced sense of loyalty, gave them information, believing it was their right as my family. I didn't see that they were measuring the size of the loot. The atmosphere at home grew heavy. I remember one afternoon when I arrived early and found them on the terrace. They didn't see me. They were flipping through luxury real estate magazines. Linda said, "When this is over, this is the area where you should buy, Emily. With what you get from the settlement, you could live like a queen without having to put up with his schedule." Emily didn't correct her. She didn't say she wanted to be with me. She simply nodded and marked a page in the magazine. I froze behind the door. I felt a hollow pit in my stomach, but I said nothing. My nature is to observe, process, and act. I retreated silently, went up to my office, and for the first time in years, locked the door behind me. That night, I analyzed my situation. Everything we owned, the main house, the vacation home, the investment accounts, the vehicles, had been built under a joint property regime. I had been naive enough to believe in "until death do us part" in the most literal sense. They knew that legally they were entitled to half of everything, but their ambition went further. They wanted more than half. They wanted total control, and they wanted me gone, with empty pockets. Linda reminded her daughter daily that she had spent her youth with me, and that came with a very high price. I began to notice small changes. Emily grew distant, almost hostile. Every conversation ended in an argument about money. If I purchased new machinery for the company, she saw it as money I was taking away from her. I realized I no longer had a wife, but an auditor waiting for my mistake. And Linda was the strategist in the shadows, the one feeding the fire of dissatisfaction. I kept providing, kept paying the unlimited credit cards, but inside me something had broken for good. Justice and loyalty were financial concepts to them. They no longer saw me as the man who had taken care of them, but as an obstacle between them and the full fortune. They were so confident in their position, so certain the law would protect the spouse, that they let their guard down. They thought I was predictable, a tired worker who would give in to avoid scandal. They didn't know that the same mind that built a company from nothing could dismantle a marriage with the same surgical precision. My silence wasn't submission. It was the time I needed to understand that my former life was over, and that I had to prepare for the war they themselves had declared. Everything exploded on a Tuesday night. There were no raised voices at first, just absolute coldness. I came home after an exhausting day, the weight of running the company heavy on my shoulders, and found them sitting in the main dining room. There was no dinner on the table, only folders spread out neatly, and two faces I no longer recognized. Emily wore that look of smug certainty that appears when someone believes they hold all the winning cards. Linda, beside her, held a glass of wine, watching me the way someone looks at an employee who's about to be fired. Emily slid an envelope across the table toward me. They weren't bills, they were divorce papers. Without a trace of remorse in her voice, she told me she no longer loved me, that she felt suffocated by my lifestyle, and that she wanted her freedom. But freedom to her came with a very specific price. The house, 60% of my liquid assets, and a lifetime alimony payment that would force me to work until the day I died just to maintain her standard of living. When I tried to speak, Linda cut me off with an icy smile. She said there was no need to make things difficult, that after all, her daughter had sacrificed too much by staying with me, and that legally I had no way out. I stood there, still holding my briefcase. I looked at them and felt a deep wave of nausea, not because of the divorce, but because of the cold precision with which they had calculated my destruction. Emily began listing alleged emotional neglect she planned to use against me if I dared to fight back. She threatened to contact my most important clients and smear my reputation, accusing me of psychological abuse that never existed. She stared straight at me and said, "Daniel, be smart. Sign this and leave. The money is the least you owe us." In that moment, I understood that to them I wasn't a human being. I was a gold mine they wanted to shut down after extracting every last ounce. The most painful part wasn't the financial threat, but the contempt in their gestures. Linda stood up, walked over to me, and gave my shoulder a condescending pat. She told me they would give me 2 days to pack my personal belongings and move to a hotel. They were kicking me out of the house I had designed and paid for myself, treating me like an intruder. Emily didn't even look at me. She was focused on her phone, probably browsing furniture catalogs for her new life. The humiliation was complete. I felt small, used, and disposable. That same night, I tried to enter my home office to retrieve some company documents. The lock had been changed. Emily stepped into the hallway, arms crossed, and told me that everything inside that room was now considered part of the disputed assets and that I couldn't touch anything without her lawyer present. That was when my patience turned into something darker. I felt a spark of silent rage, a burning inside that didn't make me shout but instead cleared my mind in a terrifying way. They thought I was weak because I had always been accommodating, but they forgot that accommodation was a choice, not a lack of character. I retreated to the guest room. I spent the night awake, listening to them laugh in the living room, celebrating their supposed victory with more wine. I could hear them planning how they would sell my car collection and remodel my office into a gym for Emily. They spoke about me in the past tense, as if I were already a financial corpse. Every word that seeped through the door was another nail in the coffin of my compassion. I didn't feel like crying. I felt an absolute need for justice. The next morning I went down to the kitchen. Linda was having breakfast and looked at me with disgust. She asked why I was still there. I didn't answer. I poured myself some coffee, my hand completely steady. Emily came in shortly after, reminding me that the deadline to leave was running out and that she had already spoken to a locksmith to change all the doors on the property by Friday morning. "None of this belongs to you anymore, Daniel. Accept it," she declared as she poured herself some organic juice. I left the house with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and my briefcase. When I reached my car, I saw that Emily had placed a property under dispute notice on the windshield. I got in, closed the door and sat in silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I was out of my home under threat of ruin, being extorted by the two people I had protected the most. But what they didn't know was that inside my briefcase I carried copies of certain contracts I had started drafting months earlier, when the smell of betrayal had become too strong to ignore. The loss was immense. They had taken my roof and my peace. But I still had my mind. And my mind was something neither of them could seize. I set myself up in a small, discreet office that an old friend from the industry lent me. I didn't need luxury. I needed silence and a reliable internet connection. My first step was to call Richard Cole, a corporate and asset protection attorney I had worked with years before. Richard wasn't a typical divorce lawyer. He was a financial shark. We met in a dimly lit coffee shop. After reading the papers Emily had handed me, he let out a dry laugh, looked at me and said, "They think they're playing chess, but they don't even realize the board belongs to you." The strategy wouldn't be explosive. It would be structural. Emily and Linda's mistake was assuming my wealth was static and that my company was nothing more than a cash box. They didn't understand how trusts or holding companies worked. For years, thanks to a gut instinct I was now grateful for, I had kept the intellectual property behind my distribution processes and the company's brand under a separate legal entity, one I had created before the marriage, and that had never been funded with marital assets. With Richard's guidance, I began the rebuild. The first move was what we called controlled suffocation. As the sole administrator of the operating company, I ordered a full internal audit. I suspended all non-essential corporate benefits, including the additional credit cards Emily had been using for personal expenses. I knew that would make them explode, but legally, under an audit triggered by detected irregularities, I was obligated to freeze unnecessary cash flow to protect minority partners, myself and my retirement fund. I spent entire days reviewing every expense Emily had run through the company over the past 5 years. I discovered that, advised by Linda, she had diverted funds to pay for renovations on a property Linda secretly owned in her own name. That was fraud. I said nothing. I saved every receipt, every transfer, every forged signature in an encrypted digital folder. I was building a steel cage bar by bar, while they believed I was somewhere crying over my bad luck. Patience was my greatest weapon. I received furious calls from Emily every day. She screamed that she couldn't pay for her yoga classes, that the club staff had declined her card. I listened to her insults with an almost unnatural calm. "We're under audit, Emily. These are standard procedures," I replied flatly before hanging up. Linda sent me messages threatening to go to the press. I answered with a brief, "Do whatever you think is necessary." I knew fear was a poor advisor, and they were starting to feel it. The legal masterstroke was enforcing a termination clause in the lease of my company's headquarters. The building we operated from belonged to an investment firm I controlled. Technically, my own company owed itself months of back rent that I had intentionally allowed to accumulate. By enforcing collection of that debt, the operating company entered a state of controlled technical insolvency. In the eyes of the divorce judge, the great prize they wanted to divide was legally disappearing, transforming into debts and obligations that I, as administrator, was required to settle. Meanwhile, I found an unexpected ally, Linda's former accountant. The man had been fired years earlier without being paid. I found him living modestly. With a bit of persuasion and the payment he was owed, he handed over records showing how Linda had been manipulating Emily to siphon money from our joint accounts into private accounts Linda controlled. I now had the complete map of their financial betrayal. They didn't just want my money, they were systematically stealing to build an escape fund. I didn't rush. Every move was calculated. Richard and I prepared the countersuit for divorce, but not through the standard civil route. We attached a criminal complaint for fraudulent administration and concealment of assets. I wanted our day in court to be about more than how much money I would give them. I wanted them explaining why they shouldn't go to prison. I woke up at 4 in the morning, reviewing laws and balance sheets. I felt more alive than ever. The adrenaline of survival had replaced the numbness of my dead marriage. I looked at photos from our wedding and felt no sadness, only the satisfaction of someone who finally sees the hidden code behind a scam. They had expelled me from my home, but I was expelling them from my future. The net was set. All that remained was for them to take the final step into the trap their own greed had built. The day of the final hearing came without photographers or television drama. Only the grave silence of a legal office, lined with wood panels and the steady hum of the air conditioning. Emily arrived accompanied by Linda. Both were dressed in black, wearing dark sunglasses, projecting the polished image of sophisticated victims they had practiced so well. They looked at me with a mix of pity and triumph. Emily placed a folder on the table, demanding the immediate liquidation of the house and full access to the company's funds. Her lawyer, a man who seemed more interested in his watch than in the case, spoke about compensatory justice. I remained silent, seated with my hands clasped on the table. Richard Cole, my attorney, didn't even open his briefcase at first. He waited until they finished their speech about the supposed fortune I was hiding. When Emily's lawyer finally stopped talking, Richard calmly took out a tablet and turned it toward them. "Before we talk about division," Richard said in a flat voice, "we need to discuss the origin of the assets and the current solvency of the marital estate." On the screen appeared records of the transfers Emily had made to Linda's hidden account over the past 36 months. Emily's face shifted from smug confidence to a sickly pale in seconds. Linda tried to speak, but Richard raised a hand. He then displayed the forensic audit report proving that the money used to renovate Linda's secret property had come directly from my company's corporate accounts, constituting fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. "This is no longer just a divorce," Richard continued. "This is criminal evidence. If this case reaches a criminal court, Mrs. Linda and her daughter could face years in prison for organized fraud and small-scale money laundering." Emily's lawyer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. He looked at his clients for an explanation and found only the silence of panic. That was when I finally spoke. My voice sounded strange even to me, cold, stripped of any trace of affection or anger. "You thought the money belonged to you because I earned it," I said, looking directly at them. "But you forgot that the same man who creates wealth knows exactly where every dollar escapes. Not only will you receive none of the company, but the company itself, having been harmed by your theft, has just filed a claim for asset restitution." The masterstroke was showing them the notice of a preventive lien placed on Linda's house and on the home where Emily was living. Due to the controlled technical insolvency I had triggered in the operating company and the accumulated debts owed to my holding, those assets were no longer part of any estate to be divided. They were now subject to creditor claims, and the primary creditor was me, through my external entities. Emily began to tremble. "You can't do this to us, Daniel. I'm your wife," she whispered. That word, wife, sounded hollow, almost insulting. Linda, regaining a bit of her venom, shouted that I was a monster and that we would see each other in the newspapers. I gestured to Richard, and he placed one final document on the table, a confidentiality agreement and a full waiver of any financial claims in exchange for not proceeding with criminal charges. "You have 10 minutes, I said, standing up. "If you sign, you keep your personal belongings and whatever is currently in your private accounts. If you don't, we're going straight to the prosecutor's office." "Linda, that house you worked so hard to renovate with my money will be auctioned in less than a month to pay my partners." The silence that followed was the most satisfying of my life. I watched them crumble. Arrogance turned into desperation. Emily looked at her mother, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Linda, for the first time, had nothing to say. Their greed had led them into a dead end where the only option was to walk away alive, but without the prize. Their lawyer whispered that it was the best offer they would receive in a lifetime. They signed with trembling hands. When Emily set the pen down on the table, she looked at me with pure hatred, no trace of the woman I had married. I felt nothing, no hate, no relief, no sadness, only the cold satisfaction of seeing order restored. They had planned my financial funeral and ended up burying their own ambitions. I picked up my briefcase, nodded to Richard, and walked out of the room without looking back. In the hallway, the air felt lighter. Betrayal has a price, and today, at last, the bill had been paid in full. Months after that day in the legal office, I sometimes stopped to think about how everything ended. There are no grand celebrations in my life, and I don't seek validation from anyone. The house where we once lived was sold to cover the audit-related debts, and now belongs to a family who, I hope, values its foundation more than we ever did. Emily and her mother moved into a small apartment in a neighborhood they used to mock. Through mutual acquaintances, I know they barely speak anymore. Guilt is an acid. It corrodes bonds when there's no money left to disguise resentment. Linda blames her daughter for not being clever enough, and Emily blames her mother for pushing her into an abyss she never truly calculated. My company has returned to normal, stronger than ever, now that the leaks of capital have been sealed. I've learned that loyalty isn't something you can buy with stability or luxury. Many men make the mistake of believing that providing is enough to earn respect, but the truth is that respect is built on clear boundaries. I didn't lose 20 years of my life. I paid 20 years' worth of lessons to understand who I am and what I'm capable of when pushed to the limit. I walk down the street and no one suspects that behind this calm-looking man stands someone who had to dismantle his own life to save his dignity. I'm not looking for a new relationship, nor do I try to convince anyone of my version of events. The results speak for themselves. The coldness with which I acted wasn't an impulse. It was a necessity. In this world, if you let others believe your pockets belong to them, they'll eventually believe your life does too. Sometimes people ask if I regret being so hard, leaving them with almost nothing after so many years. My answer is always silence. You cannot be gentle with someone who tried to destroy you while sleeping under the same roof. Justice isn't always pleasant, but it's necessary if you want to walk with your head held high. Today, my money belongs to me. My decisions belong to me. And most importantly, my peace belongs to me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories.